They said our land was nothing but dust, arid, forgotten, cracked by heat and time. Maps colored it beige, scholars footnoted it, and headlines skipped over it, as if it barely qualified as part of the modern world. Burkina Faso, once called Upper Volta, was spoken of, if at all, in past tense. A landlocked nation boxed in by hardship, where the winds of the Sahel carried more dust than promise. To the outside world, it was a footnote in someone else's story. But beneath that scorched soil, something stirred, something no satellite could see and no expert dared to predict. It wasn't just oil, it was conviction. The kind of belief that lives in the bones of a people who've been dismissed too long. The kind that whispers, "Not yet." And then came the day that silenced the doubt. At dawn, the city of Ouagadougou rose like it always did, waking slowly under the white sun, street vendors laying out oranges and cassava, taxis coughing into gear. It felt like any other day in the heart of West Africa, until it wasn't. Somewhere between the murmurs of the market and the call to prayer, a ripple passed through the capital. A newsflash, then a roar. $1.1 billion. The figure didn't just break, it detonated, echoing from minarets to millet fields. In a single announcement, the country unveiled a deal that rewrote not just headlines, but identity. Burkina Faso had struck oil, not theory, not potential. Real, profit-yielding, pipeline-flowing oil. And the deal, sealed not in some European boardroom, but right here, in the dust they told us, would never bloom. No one saw it coming. That was the magic of it. For decades, foreign experts had flown in with charts and calculations, only to pack up quickly, shaking their heads. The Sahel's oil deposits, they said, were too sparse, too unstable, too expensive to access. The soil had been drilled, mapped, and deemed commercially unviable. But what they dismissed, the people never forgot. There were stories, old ones, about dark glimmers surfacing after the rains, strange slicks bubbling near rock beds. Grandfathers told their sons, who told their daughters, not myths, memories. And when those forgotten wells finally came alive, they didn't just release crude oil, they unearthed pride. The transformation was never accidental. Buried beneath layers of doubt and bureaucracy, the oil sat waiting. All it took was someone willing to do the unthinkable. Believe that a country with no coast and no influence could defy the rules. That someone was already moving in silence, dismantling the machinery of dependence. While consultants offered theories, we dug. While papers speculated, we listened to the land. The earth remembered, even when the world did not. And on that day, when the numbers hit the airwaves, the dust turned to gold. Behind the seismic shift was a man who never waited for permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't rise through privilege or inherited wealth. He rose because he refused to bow. Young, sharp, and unshakably focused, he walked into the presidency not with promises, but with a scalpel. Bureaucracy, the bloated beast that had long strangled every opportunity, didn't stand a chance. Where others saw red tape, he saw the remnants of colonial logic, designed to stall, to confuse, to delay progress until it slipped away entirely. He tore through it without hesitation. Foreign consultants, with their suits and slides, arrived with proposals that cost more than entire villages earned in a year. Their solutions were generic, photocopied from other countries, and pasted over realities they didn't understand. Traoré listened just long enough to see through them, then showed them the door. He replaced them with local engineers who knew the smell of the Sahel after rain, who spoke in soil and stone, who had grown up beside those sleeping wells. He put trust where no one else had dared, in his own people, and that decision made all the difference. He didn't just want to extract oil, He wanted to extract sovereignty. The timing was a masterpiece of instinct and strategy. Far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the global chessboard was shifting. Conflicts in distant lands disrupted supply chains. Shipping costs soared. Sanctions ricocheted between superpowers. The world was thirsty for oil, and the traditional wells, long relied upon, began to dry or close. Prices surged, panic grew, and in that narrow window, Traoré struck. Not with desperation, but with precision. Contracts were readied, fields were primed, infrastructure was quietly built. So when the curtain lifted, Burkina Faso wasn't asking to join the game. It was flipping the board. Energy giants, the usual titans who circled Africa like vultures in suits, came rushing in. They brought familiar tactics, contracts dense with loopholes, vague promises of investment, glittering numbers that dissolved under scrutiny. They expected the usual, a seat at the head of the table, terms tilted in their favor, a quick signature, and a long siphon of profits flowing away from the people. But they had miscalculated. This time they met a government that didn't flinch. Traoré greeted them not with applause, but with a line drawn clearly in the sand. It was the birth of what would come to be known as the sovereign barrel doctrine. No deal would be signed unless Burkina Faso held the majority stake, 51% no less. No exception, no negotiation. Ownership was not just symbolic, it was structural. The era of extraction without compensation was over. Gone were the days of trading billions for breadcrumbs. The oil under the Sahel would be harnessed, refined, and distributed with the nation's future in mind. The wealth, for once, would stay home. It was more than a policy. It was a signal to the world. Burkina Faso wasn't for sale. The announcement echoed like a drumbeat across every village, every crowded bus, every tin-roofed marketplace. It wasn't just about the billion. That number, colossal as it was, meant something deeper. Proof that they hadn't been dreaming in vain. From Ouagadougou to the smallest farming hamlets in the north, people flooded the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. Children ran barefoot through dust clouds, women danced with pots balanced on their heads, and elders stood still, letting the moment sink in. There were no campaign banners or political slogans, only something that hadn't been seen in generations: collective pride. This wasn't about wealth, it was about worth. For decades, the nation had been told to wait, to accept crumbs from the global table. But now, that table was being set by their own hands. And with that pride came responsibility, a chance not just to spend, but to build. Captain Traoré wasted no time. Before the ink dried on the contracts, he issued the first executive order, the creation of the Burkina National Energy Fund. Not a shadowy offshore account or vague government project, but a transparent, legally bound institution. Its purpose was simple and radical: to ensure that every dollar from oil served the people. Every transaction was to be public. Every investment approved by an independent parliamentary board. This fund would not exist in secret corridors of power. It would live in the daylight, where every citizen could see how the wealth was used. Schools, clinics, roads, water. These weren't promises. They were plans, stamped, budgeted, and already breaking ground. The oil wasn't the end goal. It was a tool, a lever to uplift, not a shortcut to luxury. And Traoré wasn't done. He issued a directive that stunned industry analysts and delighted workers across the country. Not a single barrel would be exported raw. Burkina Faso would no longer be a supplier of raw materials for someone else's gain. Refineries would rise from the dust, built not by foreign contractors, but by local hands. Technical schools opened new departments overnight. Engineers were trained not abroad, but right here, on Burkinabe soil. A generation of youth, once resigned to unemployment or migration, now saw a path forward that didn't require leaving home. Jobs weren't trickling in, they were erupting. Within 6 months, villages that had lived for decades in darkness flickered to life. Electrification rates jumped in rural zones. Remote clinics reported their first refrigerated vaccines, thanks to stable power. Schools extended hours as students, once limited by sunlight, studied into the evening under LED bulbs powered by local grids. The rhythm of life began to change. Faster, fuller, brighter, and across the land, one idea began to take root. Not oil, not profit, but possibility. He could have crowned himself. Others had. History is full of men who seized sudden wealth and wrapped it around themselves like royalty, distributing favors, building palaces, and leaving the people in the shadows. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré chose a different path. No portraits in every hallway, no golden thrones or extravagant motorcades. Just an unrelenting focus on redesigning the very bones of governance. He didn't see the oil as a personal victory. It was a mandate, a chance to correct generations of systemic failure. The corruption that had once flourished quietly in back rooms and padded contracts was confronted head-on. Audits became routine. Insider deals vanished. Every public official, from ministers to village administrators, was held to measurable performance standards. This wasn't a one-man revolution. It was the architecture of a nation being rewritten in real time. As the headlines spread, so did the confusion in diplomatic circles. The usual phone calls weren't being returned. Traditional gatekeepers of African finance, representatives from the IMF, EU, and Western consulting firms, suddenly found themselves on the outside, requesting meetings instead of commanding them. For years, Burkina Faso had been a case study in dependency, a file folder passed between aid committees and debt relief programs. But now, that same nation was hosting its own investment forums, setting its own terms, and watching as global powers lined up to understand how the tables had turned. The shift wasn't just political, it was psychological. A continent long seen as a recipient of charity was beginning to speak in the language of control. Where once Burkina Faso had knocked at the doors of foreign ministries, it now opened its own, inviting only those who came with respect and responsibility. Captain Traoré didn't use hostility, he used precision. Infrastructure for access deals became the standard. If a company wanted oil, they had to build roads. If a delegation wanted partnerships, they had to invest in hospitals. It wasn't a blockade, it was a recalibration. Africa, once spoken for, was now speaking back, and the people knew it. To make sure every citizen understood not only what was changing, but why, the government launched the most ambitious public education campaign in the country's history. State-run radio stations, which reached even the most remote communities, began broadcasting programs that broke down the oil economy into everyday language. From how crude becomes cash to how that cash becomes clinics and textbooks, no topic was off-limits. Markets buzzed with conversation. School teachers used national budget charts as teaching tools. Transparency became more than a promise. It became culture. Every transaction from the Burkina National Energy Fund was published monthly. Accessible, audited, discussed. The oil was no longer a mystery, it belonged to everyone. And in the eyes of the people, that was more powerful than any throne. In the polished halls of Paris, in the wood-paneled conference rooms of Brussels, and the glass towers of Washington, unease settled like fog. Burkina Faso, long categorized as manageable, predictable, marginal, had detonated expectations. Suddenly, it wasn't asking for help. it was negotiating. Former colonial powers called emergency summits behind closed doors. Policy memos were hastily rewritten. Intelligence analysts who once tracked insurgencies in the Sahel were now briefing their governments on energy flows and strategic influence. The question wasn't just how did this happen, but what does this mean for the rest of Africa? The panic wasn't spoken aloud, but it was visible in the rushed visits, the sudden charm offensives, the carefully worded communiques offering new partnerships. But behind the handshakes was an undeniable truth. The old order was cracking. Back in Ouagadougou, Captain Traoré moved with calm certainty. He ordered a full review of all existing foreign resource contracts, many of which had been signed in opacity under prior regimes. The findings were stark. Deals that siphoned vast wealth out of the country while leaving barely enough to patch potholes. Within weeks, 14 contracts were cancelled outright. No negotiations, no delays. This wasn't revenge, it was realignment. From that point forward, every new deal came with a non-negotiable clause. Foreign companies were required to invest directly in national infrastructure. Roads, schools, power grids, no extraction without construction, no barrels without balance. The message was crystal clear. Access came with obligation. It was a move that shocked multinational boardrooms and thrilled millions across Africa. And they were watching closely. From the dusty ministries of Niger to the administrative compounds in Mali, leaders began to take notice. Delegations quietly arrived in Burkina Faso's capital, notebooks in hand, questions ready. They weren't just curious, they were inspired. How had a landlocked country with limited historical leverage managed to flip the dynamics so dramatically? What had once been dismissed as an anomaly was now looking like a template. A regional momentum began to build. For the first time in decades, neighboring nations started seeing themselves not as isolated, resource-dependent states, but as collaborators in a broader economic awakening. The Burkinabe model wasn't about copying. It was about unlocking, about building strategies rooted in sovereignty, not dependency. From Dakar to Bamako, talk of energy autonomy and shared refining initiatives sparked new conversations. But it wasn't just about geopolitics. On the ground, in the soil, real lives were shifting. Traoré's one barrel, one village initiative transformed theory into touch. For every 1,000 barrels of oil extracted, one village received a comprehensive development package. Not charity, entitlement. The logic was beautiful in its simplicity. If the nation gained, so should the people. Solar panels lit up remote classrooms. Smart irrigation tools appeared in once parched fields. Fiber optic cables connected towns that had never seen a computer. In these villages, the revolution had a face. Elders held community meetings with engineers. Teenagers launched apps to track resource delivery. Women's cooperatives used microgrants from oil taxes to process shea butter and export textiles. What was once the edge of the map became its heartbeat. For the first time, the village was no longer an afterthought. It was the center. The buses that once carried young men out of the countryside in search of work were now rolling in the opposite direction. From city slums and border towns, a silent migration was reversing itself. Young people, long resigned to leaving their villages behind, were returning. Not out of necessity, but by choice. They came back not to wait for aid, but to build. Construction sites buzzed in places that once echoed only with silence. Solar fields rose where thorn bushes had grown. Rural tech labs opened in community halls, and the talk around tea stalls shifted from survival to strategy. Opportunity had returned to the ground it came from. Women, often overlooked in traditional development plans, were now leading their own revolutions. Cooperatives sprang up, fueled by microgrants drawn directly from oil taxes. In the north, women processed shea and moringa in solar-powered facilities. In the west, they wove textiles for export, managed distribution apps, and trained younger girls in finance and logistics. Local products no longer trickled out of dusty markets. They were scaled, branded, and tracked on digital dashboards. Production wasn't just local, it was intelligent. From this movement emerged something even more unexpected: innovation. Traoré's administration invested in what they called desert intelligence, the untapped knowledge born from generations of surviving the Sahel. Engineers and farmers came together in what began as small incubators, but quickly evolved into an innovation cluster that drew attention far beyond the region. The focus wasn't on mimicking Silicon Valley, but on solving hyperlocal problems with radical creativity. Devices to reduce diesel dependence, waterless sanitation systems, modular micro-refineries, solutions born not from luxury, but necessity. What the outside world called poverty, they called untapped imagination. And that philosophy began to reshape the very machinery of the state. Ministries, once bloated and opaque, were overhauled. Each agency was now measured by KPIs, real outcomes, not theoretical targets. Officials were evaluated based on school enrollments, kilometers of roads completed, clinics operational. Monthly budget reports were publicly released, with color-coded dashboards anyone could read, even on a basic mobile phone. The state didn't behave like an empire. It moved like a startup, fast, agile, accountable. And the world noticed. Foreign journalists, long accustomed to tragic tropes and familiar storylines, arrived expecting dust and desperation. What they found stunned them. Headlines changed. Burkina Faso defies the odds. The new face of African power. Not just oil, a new vision. Major publications that once buried stories from West Africa deep in their world sections now featured Ouagadougou on the front page. The narrative shifted from pity to parody, from cautionary tale to case study. But the greatest shift wasn't in tone, it was in posture. Burkina Faso no longer crouched, it stood. This was no longer a story about oil, it was about intention. Traoré never claimed perfection, but he delivered purpose. He rejected the myth that Africa's role was to follow and insisted it could lead. The wealth beneath the soil was only useful if it lifted lives above it. That idea, simple but unrelenting, became his North Star, and it spread. Scholars from Dakar, youth leaders from Lagos, policymakers in Accra began to cite what they called the Burkinabe method, not a formula for exporting barrels, but for exporting hope. A way of doing development without dependency. A model where resources were not the point, they were the fuel. The real product was dignity, ownership, direction. Burkina Faso had gone from forgotten to foundational. And yet, what felt like a climax was only the beginning. The machines kept humming. The schools kept filling. The charts kept rising. The billion-dollar day became year one of a longer journey. This wasn't a miracle. It was a movement. A quiet, firm declaration that the continent was not waiting anymore. It was building, and this was the blueprint.